Odysseus, a liar, a pirate, a trickster, a serial adulterer. If you're his enemy, you'll certainly die. And if you're his friend, you'll also certainly die, but in a truly horrible way. And if you ask him to pick something up from the shop, you'll probably never see him again. In the history of mankind, he has the worst sense of direction ever. This is the story of a man who turned a simple trip home into a decade-long horror show and still somehow became one of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology. Welcome to the Mysteries of Mythology, the Odyssey. Since Christopher Nolan announced he'd be making a movie based on the epic poem, the world and their friend have become more interested in the Odyssey. The Odyssey is technically a sequel to the Iliad, where Brad Pitt sleeps with lots of women and goes to war against the good guys because the bad guy king loses his wife to Orlando Bloom. The original version has a lot more gods interfering and making deals with men, and pretty much makes the point that women are the root of all evil. Homer must have had mummy issues or just come out of a really bad relationship, because the theme of women being evil runs deep in the Odyssey, more so than you might think. But in the epic we're looking at today, there are more flashbacks than a season of Lost, and fewer gods than in the last book. And to make that explicitly clear, Homer starts the journey on Mount Olympus, with the gods sitting together, enjoying some Gyros. On Mount Olympus, the gods sat together doing god things. Athena was feeling stressed. She had hardcore sapiosexual brain love for our hero, Odysseus, who was famous for his wit and cunning, and felt that it was unfair that he had been trapped on a paradise island for the last 7 years, with a beautiful nymph who gave him everything he wanted and made love to him every night, even offering him immortality. If this was my story, it would have ended here. But this was our hero, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the man who survived Troy. And each day he sat on the shores of the island, Ogygia, crying, praying for the day he could return to his home to see his wife and son. Athena couldn't stand it. She stood before Zeus and pleaded Odysseus' case. She reminded him of everything Odysseus had done, how he had fought bravely for the Greeks at Troy, how he had honored the gods, how he was clever enough to survive when better men had fallen. She pointed out the injustice of it all, that a mortal as loyal as Odysseus should waste away, imprisoned by the will of a lonely goddess, while his home was overrun by arrogant suitors trying to steal his wife and kingdom. Zeus listened, and for once, he agreed. Zeus commanded Hermes, the messenger god, to carry the message to Calypso, the goddess nymph holding Odysseus prisoner. When Hermes delivered the order of Zeus, Calypso was furious. After all, she didn't have Tinder, and Ann Summers didn't deliver there. She accused the gods of hypocrisy, jealous that she, a woman, had dared to take a mortal lover when male gods did it without any consequence. But anger or not, she obeyed. She found Odysseus still staring across the endless waves. She told him he was free to go. Odysseus didn't trust her at first. It wouldn't be the first time a smiling god had lied to him. But Calypso swore a binding oath on the river Styx that she meant him no harm. She even helped him build a raft, stocked it with food and wine, and sent him into the open sea. For 17 days he sailed, pushed by winds, almost able to see the coastline of Scheria, the land of the Phaeacians, who could give him safe passage home. But things weren't going to be that easy. Poseidon, the god of the sea, returning from his trip to Ethiopia, spotted Odysseus on a raft and erupted in fury. Odysseus had killed his son by sticking a burning stake into his eye, but we'll get to that later. With a single blow of his trident, Poseidon sent storms to tear the raft apart. Odysseus clung to the wreckage, thrown from wave to wave, battered and half drowned. It would have been the end of Odysseus, if not for the sea goddess named Enor. Taking pity on him, Enor rose from the foam and offered him a veil, a magic cloth that would keep him afloat, no matter the fury of the sea. She told him to strip off his clothes, abandon the broken raft, and swim for land with only the veil to save him. Desperate, Odysseus obeyed. For 2 days he fought the waves, struggling towards the faint promise of land. At last, battered and almost dead, he was flung onto the rocky coast of Scheria, naked, exhausted, but alive. He had reached the land of the Phaeacians. While Odysseus lay unconscious on the beaches of Scheria, half drowned and naked, life back at home in Ithaca was a disaster. After 20 years of Odysseus being away, most people had given up hope that their king would return. His palace had become a free-for-all. Over 100 suitors, young, arrogant, rich enough to cause problems, but not smart enough to solve them, had moved in, eating Odysseus's food, drinking his wine, and harassing his wife. Penelope, queen of Ithaca and wife of Odysseus, had spent years fending them off with every trick she could think of. She promised them that she would choose a new husband once she had finished weaving a funeral shroud for Odysseus's elderly father. What she didn't mention was that each night she unraveled her work and started again the next day. The suitors weren't exactly geniuses. It took them 3 years to notice. But even Penelope's patience had limits, and even her cleverness couldn't hold off an army of greedy men forever. Telemachus, Odysseus' only son, wasn't a boy anymore, but he wasn't quite a man either. He sat by the fires at night, gripping the arms of the chair, silent, burning, furious, and helpless. Everyone expected him to act like a king, to be more like his father, but no one offered to help him. And then Athena arrived in Ithaca, disguised as Mentor, an old family friend of Odysseus and king of the Taphians. Athena found Telemachus brooding alone. Telemachus asked if the guest knew anything about his father's fate. Mentor replied that he didn't know exactly where Odysseus was, but he was certain the king was alive and fighting to return home. Athena urged Telemachus to act. Now that he was no longer a boy, it was time to seek the truth for himself. Emboldened by Athena's message, tired of the way things were, and no longer afraid to speak up to men desecrating his home, Telemachus decided to take action. The next day, for the first time in his life, Telemachus called an assembly. He stood before the elders of Ithaca and demanded justice. He told the suitors to leave, to stop bleeding his house dry, and act like the men that they claimed to be. The suitors laughed in his face. The elders looked awkward and said it was a shame, and that someone really ought to do something. And then they went back to their wine. If Telemachus wanted to save his family, he would have to do it himself. That night, under Athena's guidance, Telemachus slipped away. He gathered a small crew and with Athena's blessing set sail from the hidden coves of Ithaca, heading across the wine-dark sea to find word of his father. Back in the palace, Penelope woke to find her son gone. And the suitors, realizing the game might be slipping from their fingers, started sharpening their knives. Telemachus had thrown the first stone. Now the gods, and whatever was left of fate, would decide what happened next. Telemachus arrived in Pylos, ruled by King Nestor, one of the oldest survivors of the Trojan War. A man so wise and respected that even the gods didn't bother him. When Telemachus arrived, the people of Pylos were in the middle of a grand feast. They were sacrificing black bulls to Poseidon, god of the sea, offering prayers and roasting meat over giant fires. Telemachus was nervous to interrupt the festival, but Athena, still disguised, urged him forward. In the world of the Greeks, hospitality or xenia was everything. It didn't matter if you was a beggar, a king, a shipwrecked stranger, you were supposed to be fed, welcomed, and given the chance to speak. Nestor, true to the tradition, greeted the new arrivals with warmth. He offered them food and drink, asked no questions until they were ready to talk. Telemachus took a deep breath. He spoke of his father, of the house crumbling under the weight of greedy men, of a mother trapped by endless schemes, of a son left to grow up without a guide. And he asked, had Nestor heard anything of Odysseus? Nestor sighed and spoke of the long years after Troy, how the Greek kings had quarrelled among themselves, how the gods had turned against them, how so many ships had been lost to storms, vengeance, and even their own stupidity. He had seen the ruin of Agamemnon, the wandering of Menelaus, the death of friends and brothers. But of Odysseus, he knew nothing. They had parted after Troy, and Nestor had not seen him since. But Nestor was not a man to leave a guest without help. He advised Telemachus to travel on to Sparta to find King Menelaus, the man who had wandered half the known world before finding his way home. If anyone knew the fate of Odysseus, it would be him. And to make sure the boy wasn't travelling alone, Nestor sent his own son, Phaeacians, to accompany him, a friend, a guide, and a guard on the road ahead. Telemachus left Pylos with a little more hope than he had brought with him, a friend with a funny name, and a little less fear. Telemachus and Pisistratos travelled on, their ship crossing calm waters until the towers of Sparta came into view. Here ruled King Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon, husband of the famous Helen of Troy, the woman whose face had launched 1,000 ships and whose choices had burned the city to the ground. When they arrived, the palace was in the middle of a wedding feast. Menelaus' son and daughter were both being married, not to each other, but to their own partners. But in Greek mythology, you never know. Menelaus noticed the strangers at once. Hospitality was sacred here too. Telemachus and Pisistratus were brought in, bathed, given clothes, and seated at the table, where they were served meat and wine without question. Only once they had eaten did Menelaus speak. He asked who they were, where they had come from, and what business had brought them so far from home. Telemachus hesitated, but Menelaus' kindness and the way his eyes sharpened at the mention of Ithaca gave him courage. He spoke of Odysseus, of a house filled with vultures, of a mother trapped, of a father lost. Menelaus listened carefully. Then, without waiting, Helen spoke. She looked at Telemachus and saw the truth immediately. He was Odysseus' son, there was no doubt. Menelaus agreed, and slowly, between sips of wine and memories of blood, he told them what he knew. After the fall of Troy, Menelaus had been stranded far from home. In Egypt, desperate for answers, he had captured the shape-shifting sea god, Proteus, and forced him to speak. Proteus had told him that many of the Greeks were dead, but Odysseus lived. He was trapped, stranded on an island, held there by a goddess who refused to let him go. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Telemachus felt something shift inside of him. His father was alive. The next day, Menelaus offered gifts and promises of help, but Telemachus didn't stay long. There was still danger back home, and men who would kill him before they let him rule. As he prepared to leave back to Ithaca, the suitors were already setting their trap. Telemachus was no longer just a boy looking for answers. Now, he was a threat. Odysseus woke in a heap of sand and seaweed, battered by the waves, half dead from exhaustion. He staggered inland, dragging his broken body past the rocks and trees, until he found shelter under a pair of olive trees. There, hidden from the sun and the world, he collapsed. While Odysseus slept, the gods were still moving pieces into place. Athena, who had not finished saving him yet, visited the dreams of a young princess named Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous and Queen Arete of Scheria. She planted an idea in the girl's mind, that it was time to do the laundry. Dream logic being what it is, Nausicaa woke up convinced this was a brilliant plan. She gathered her maids, loaded up a cart of clothes and food, and set out for the river. At the river, they washed the linens, laughing and playing as they waited for the sun to dry the fabrics. Their voices carried across the fields. Odysseus, roused by the sound of laughter, forced himself to his feet. He was filthy, naked, and wild-eyed, hardly the image of a respectable hero, but he had no choice. Wrapping a branch around his waist for what little dignity he could manage, Odysseus stepped from the trees and approached the girls. While the maids screamed and fled, Nausicaa held her ground. Athena had given her courage, and besides, something about the rugged man was different. The way he spoke, the way he carried himself even in ruin. Odysseus chose his words carefully. He didn't grab or beg. He praised her beauty, compared her to Artemis, and asked only for clothing and directions to the nearest town. Nausicaa, moved by his politeness and pitying his state, agreed to help. She gave him food, drink, and fresh clothes, and told him how to find her father's palace. She warned him, though, better to approach the queen first. Arete had the real power in Scheria. If he could win her favour, everything else would follow. Odysseus prayed for luck, and for once, the gods seemed to be willing to listen. Following Nausicaa's instructions, Odysseus made his way through the fields of Scheria, heading towards the shining palace of King Alcinous. Athena, not leaving things to chance, wrapped him in a mist, hiding him from the eyes of the townspeople as he walked through the streets. When he reached the palace, he paused. It wasn't like anything he had seen before. The walls shone with polished bronze. The gardens bloomed with fruits that never spoiled. Servants of gold and silver, built by Hephaestus himself, stood at the doors. This was no ordinary kingdom. Inside, Queen Arete sat beside her husband, King Alcinous, surrounded by their sons and daughters, all feasting and laughing beneath the glow of torches. Still hidden by the mist, Odysseus crossed the hall. At Athena's whispered command, he threw himself at Arete's feet, clasping her knees, and begged for mercy, the traditional sign of a suppliant seeking help. At that moment, Athena lifted the mist. The room fell silent. There stood a stranger, battered by the sea but carrying himself like a king. For a moment, no one moved. Then Alcinous stood and welcomed him in, calling for food, drink, and a seat at the feast. The laws of hospitality demanded it, and besides, there was something about this man, something in his voice, his bearing, that felt different. Arete was the first to question him. She noticed that the clothes he wore were her own handiwork, fine garments she had given to Nausicaa to pack. Odysseus, careful and clever, told enough of the truth to satisfy her. He praised Nausicaa's kindness without putting her in an awkward position. Alcinous, pleased by the stranger's manners and moved by his suffering, promised that once the feast was done, Odysseus would be given a ship and safe passage home. But before he could leave, he would first have to reveal who he truly was, and what terrible roads had brought him to their shores. The next day, the Phaeacians gathered in the hall of Alcinous. There was a feast as always, rich food, strong wine, music played by the blind bard Demodocus, the one that everyone thinks is supposed to be Homer. At first, Odysseus sat quietly, hidden behind his borrowed name and ragged story. But when Demodocus sang of Troy, of the wooden horse, of the fall of the city, Odysseus broke. He turned away from the others, trying to hide the tears that spilled down his face. Alcinous saw it. No ordinary man wept like that for a story. No man wept for the fall of Troy unless he stood within its walls. He asked the stranger, gently but firmly, to tell the truth. Not just where he came from, who he was, what he had seen, what had broken him. Odysseus rose. He stood before the court of Scheria, a ruined king, a survivor of gods and monsters, and spoke the words he had held back for so long. He gave his name. Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. The hall fell silent. And then, in a voice worn thin by years of storms and loss, Odysseus began to tell his story. A story of broken ships, dead comrades, lying kings, vengeful gods, witches, monsters, and promises made under black skies. A story no one in that hall would ever forget. After the fall of Troy, Odysseus and his men sailed homeward with full sails and high hopes. They should have kept moving. Instead, they stopped at Ismarus, the city of the Cicones, and fell back into old habits. They raided the town, killed the men, and took the women and treasures as prizes. Odysseus, sharper than most, warned his men to leave immediately, but they didn't listen. They stayed too long, drunk on victory and wine. By the time the Cicones' allies arrived, trained warriors riding in from the hills, the Greeks were scattered and unprepared. The battle was short and brutal. Some of Odysseus' men were killed, the first of many. The survivors barely made it back to their ships, fighting through blood and sand to escape. It was a hard reminder. Troy might have fallen, but their war with the world was far from over, and the gods were watching. The winds carried Odysseus and his battered fleet south. Days blurred into nights. The sea was endless, the men were exhausted. When they sighted land, they thought the gods had finally shown mercy. It was the coast of a strange, quiet people, the Lotus-Eaters. At first, there was no danger. The locals offered food and gifts with open hands. They gave Odysseus' men fruit from the lotus plant, soft, sweet, golden. Those who ate the lotus forgot. They forgot the storm, they forgot the war, they forgot their home. They wanted only to stay, to drift forever in a haze of pleasure and forgetfulness. When Odysseus realized what was happening, he acted fast. He dragged his men back to the ship by force. He tied them down if he had to. He ordered the others to row hard and blind away from the shore. Better the open sea, better even death, than to lose themselves in a living dream. Odysseus and his men sailed west, carried by restless winds, until they came to a wild rocky island. On the mainland beyond, the Cyclopses lived. Giant shepherds, each one savage and careless of the gods. Curious or reckless, Odysseus led a small group inland. They carried with them a skin of potent wine, a gift too valuable to waste, and the hope of trade. They found a vast cave full of cheese, milk, and penned animals, but there was no host appeared. The men wanted to grab what they could and flee, but Odysseus refused. He wanted to meet the master of the house, to claim the rights of a guest under the sacred law. So they waited. As the sun set, the owner of the cave returned, a giant cyclops named Polyphemus. He herded his flock into the cave, rolled a massive stone over the entrance, and then he saw them. He saw strangers standing in his home, and without a word, he grabbed two of Odysseus' men and smashed their heads against the stone and ate them raw. Odysseus asked for the sacred ritual of hospitality, but the Cyclops ignored him. For days, Odysseus plotted. Fighting the Cyclops directly was impossible. They couldn't move the boulder without him. They needed a plan. Using the wine they had carried, Odysseus offered it to Polyphemus, praising his strength, flattering his pride. The Cyclops, pleased and greedy, demanded to know the stranger's name. Odysseus smiled and said, "Nobody." Polyphemus drank heavily and collapsed into a drunken stupor. While he slept, Odysseus and his men heated a sharpened wooden stake in a fire until it glowed. Then, altogether, they drove it deep into Cyclops' single eye. Polyphemus roared in agony. His neighbors, hearing the noise, called out to ask who was hurting him. "Nobody!" Polyphemus screamed. "Nobody is hurting me!" Hearing that, they left him alone. Blinded, Polyphemus groped around the cave, guarding the entrance by touch. Odysseus tied his men under the bellies of the giant sheep. When morning came, and the beasts were let out to graze, they slipped beneath the shaggy hides, crawling to freedom. They made it back to the ships. Odysseus could have just sailed away, but his pride stinging could not leave quietly. He shouted back across the water, revealing his true name. Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. Polyphemus, half blind and bleeding, lifted his hand to the sky and prayed. He prayed to Poseidon, god of the sea, his father. He asked for vengeance. A storm rose behind the Greek ships, and from that moment, Odysseus' journey home was cursed. Battered but alive, Odysseus and his men sailed on. They came to the floating island of Aeolia, ruled by Aeolus, the god of the winds. Aeolus welcomed them with feasts and gifts. He listened to Odysseus' story and, moved by it, decided to help. He gathered every unruly wind, every storm, every gale, and sealed them in a leather bag. He gave it to Odysseus, warning him to guard it well. With the winds trapped, nothing would stop their voyage home. For 9 days they sailed. Ithaca was so close that Odysseus could see the fires on the cliffs. Relieved, he decided to take a nap. While he slept, his men, greedy and suspicious, whispered among themselves. They were certain the bag held gold, stolen from Aeolus, hidden by their captain. Driven by jealousy and hunger, they opened it. The trap winds screamed out, roaring across the sea, tearing the ships away from Ithaca and hurling them back into the open water. When Odysseus woke, the coastline of home was gone. Only the endless sea stretched before him. Broken with rage and grief, he turned his ships back to Aeolia. But Aeolus, seeing Odysseus now as cursed by the gods, refused to help him again. He drove them from his island, warning them never to return. Odysseus had been within sight of home, and he had lost it. After being thrown back into open waters, Odysseus and his men sailed from island to island, each stranger and harsher than the last. They came at last to a land that seemed peaceful, harbours sheltered by high cliffs, calm waters, a wide bay deep enough for every ship. The fleet pulled in except for Odysseus, suspicious after so many disasters. He anchored his own ship outside the harbour, tethered to the rocks. He sent a few men inland to scout. They found a tall girl at a well, the daughter of the local king. She smiled and led them to her father's palace. But it was a trap. The king, Antiphates, was no man. He was a Laestrygonian, a giant with a thirst for human flesh. He seized one of Odysseus' scouts and tore him apart on the spot. The others ran, but it was too late. The giants poured over the hills and cliffs, massive shapes with clubs and stones, smashing the ships trapped in the bay like toys in a basin. Men were speared, crushed, dragged screaming into the depths. Only Odysseus, anchored outside the harbour, saw the attack in time. He cut his lines, shouted for his surviving men and fled into the open sea. Of the 12 ships that had left Troy, only Odysseus's remained. The sea dragged what was left of Odysseus's men to the island of Aiaia. It was a strange place, wild and thick with forests, but smoke rose gently from somewhere inland. Odysseus sent a scouting party, led by his trusted officer, Eurylochus. They followed the smoke until they found a great house standing alone in the trees. A woman lived there, beautiful, golden-haired, singing softly as she wove her loom. She welcomed them inside, gave them food and wine, and when they were full and laughing, she touched them with her wand and turned them into pigs. Only Eurylochus, wary from the start, had stayed outside. He fled back to the ship with the news. Odysseus took up his sword and set out alone. On his path, Hermes appeared, the messenger god, moving between gods and men. Hermes gave Odysseus a herb called moly, a black root with a white flower, and told him how to resist Circe's magic. When Odysseus reached the house, Circe tried to enchant him, as she had with the others, but the magic failed. Odysseus stood before her, sword drawn, unbroken. Circe, startled and impressed, dropped her spells. She swore no further harm would come to him. At his demand, she restored his men to their true forms. The food must have been good, and maybe the moly, because for a whole year Odysseus and his men stayed with Circe. It would have been easy to forget Ithaca altogether, but when the seasons turned and the longing for home grew too sharp to ignore, Odysseus asked to leave. Circe agreed, but warned him that the road ahead would be darker than anything he had faced so far. Before he could turn to Ithaca, he would have to journey to the land of the dead and speak to the blind prophet, Tiresias. Only then would he know the path home. Guided by Circe's instructions, Odysseus sailed north until he reached the edge of the world, where the land ended and the mist of death began. There, at the mouth of the dark river Acheron, he and his men dug a trench. They poured offerings into it, milk, honey, wine, and blood from a black ram to summon the dead. Just as a footnote, this might be one of the reasons we associate the dead with wanting blood, adding to the lore of vampires. But back to the story. The spirits rose from the darkness, drawn to the scent of life. Ghosts of warriors, mothers, lost children, nameless crowds who would never know peace. Odysseus stood his ground, sword drawn, keeping them back until the one he had sought appeared. Tiresias, the blind prophet, found his way to the blood. He spoke in a voice like wind through stone. Tiresias warned Odysseus that the gods were not finished punishing him. He could still reach home, but only if he and his men avoided the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. If they touched them, death would follow. Tiresias also warned that Odysseus would find trouble in Ithaca, that his home would be overrun, and justice would come only through blood. When the prophecy was given, the dead pressed closer. Among them, Odysseus saw the shade of his mother, Anticlea, who had died of grief during his absence. He tried to embrace her, but his hands passed through her like smoke. He met the ghosts of old comrades from Troy, Agamemnon, betrayed and murdered by his wife, warning him to trust no one, even his wife Penelope, and not to reveal his identity to her immediately. Achilles told him he would rather be a poor farmer alive on earth than a king of all the dead. Ajax, who refused even to speak to him, still bitter over old rivalries. Each ghost spoke of loss, sorrow, and the futility of glory. At last, overwhelmed by the crush of the dead and the weight of their words, Odysseus fled back to the ship. With the dead behind them and the open sea ahead, Odysseus and his men returned to Circe's island. She kept her promise. Circe warned Odysseus of the dangers still waiting for him. First among them, the Sirens. Creatures with voices so beautiful that any man who heard their song would forget everything and steer their ships into the rocks. There was only one way to survive. Circe told him to plug the ears of his crew with soft wax so they couldn't hear the music. As for himself, if he wished to hear the song, he must be bound to the mast, hands and feet tied fast, no matter how much he begged to be released. Odysseus seemed to like the idea of being tied up. When their ship neared the Sirens' island, he sealed the men's ears with wax and ordered them to tie him tight against the mast. The waters grew strangely still. The Sirens began to sing. Their voices weren't loud, they were soft, silver tones weaving promises of knowledge, glory, and peace. Odysseus strained against the ropes, desperate to follow the sound, to abandon everything. He shouted, he pleaded, he ordered his men to untie him, but they couldn't hear him. They rowed harder, eyes fixed on the horizon, pulling the ship past the rocks, past the ruins of other ships and bones that littered the shore. When the song faded into silence, the men stopped rowing. They untied their captain, and the ship sailed on, leaving the Sirens' island behind them, swallowed by the mist. There was no safe path between Scylla and Charybdis. On one side, Charybdis, a whirlpool so vast it could swallow a ship whole and leave nothing behind. On the other side, Scylla, a female monster with 6 heads, each one waiting to snatch a man from the deck. There was no cleverness here, no trick, only a choice. Odysseus chose Scylla. Better to lose a few men than to lose them all. Remember what I told you about being his friend? He told his crew to row hard, to stay close to the cliffs, and not to look at the monster in the mists above. He didn't tell them what was waiting. Some things were better faced without fear. They rowed as fast as they could. The sea boiled beneath them. Charybdis roared to their left, sucking down the ocean with sounds like 1,000 men drowning. And then, from the cliffs, Scylla struck. 6 great heads, 6 snapping jaws. 6 men plucked, screaming from the deck and carried into the fog. Odysseus heard every cry. He saw every death, but he could do nothing. They sailed on, broken but alive, leaving the monster's island behind them. After escaping Scylla and Charybdis, Odysseus and his men drifted on broken sails and battered hope. They reached the island of Thrinacia, sacred to Helios, god of the sun. Circe and Tiresias had both warned him, do not touch the cattle, no matter how hungry, no matter how desperate. Odysseus passed the warning to his men, swore them to an oath, and they agreed. But the storms pinned them down. Days became weeks and food ran out. The men, starving and desperate, did what hunger always drives men to do. While Odysseus slept, they slaughtered the sacred cattle. They built fires on the beach. They cooked the holy cows and ate. When Odysseus woke, it was too late. Helios, furious, demanded vengeance from Zeus, and Zeus agreed. When the winds cleared, they all set sail again. But as they crossed the open water, a black storm rose over the sea. Lightning struck the ship, tearing it apart. The mast snapped, the hull shattered, men were thrown screaming into the waves. One by one, they drowned. Only Odysseus, clinging to the wreckage, survived. The sea carried him back towards the cliffs of Charybdis. He held the broken timbers, clinging to the life as a whirlpool swallowed the world around him. When the tides turned, he drifted free, alone, without a ship, without a crew, without hope. The currents carried him across the endless waters until he washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, into the hands of the nymph Calypso. And there, for 7 long years, the journey ended. When Odysseus finished speaking, the hall was silent. The Phaeacians who listened through the night, through shipwrecks, monsters, storms, and betrayal, sat heavy with the weight of it all. No lies, no boasts. Only the truth of the man who had lost everything but the will to keep moving. King Alcinous stood. He promised Odysseus what no other stranger had managed to give him. Safe passage home, and a ship was prepared that very day. The Phaeacians, masters of the sea, loaded it with treasures and supplies, gifts worthy of a king. At sunset, Odysseus boarded their sleek black ship, lay down on the bed of soft cloths, and for the first time in years, slept without fear. The ship flew over the water, faster than a hawk. While he dreamed of Ithaca, the sailors carried him across the wine-dark sea, silent and sure. Before the first light touched the horizon, they reached the shores of Ithaca. They carried Odysseus to the sand, laid him gently down with his gifts beside him, and left him sleeping. By the time he opened his eyes, they were gone, and after so many years of war, shipwreck, and sorrow, Odysseus was home. But home was not what he remembered, and the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. After 20 years, he was home. Standing beside him was a young man, handsome, clever-eyed, standing where no man should have been. But Odysseus had learned the ways of the gods by now. The youth smiled, and the smile stretched into something older, sharper, and wiser. It was Athena. She revealed herself fully, no more disguises. She praised Odysseus for his caution. Other men would have run shouting into the open, into the arms of their enemies. Odysseus stayed silent, thinking, watching, measuring. It was why she loved him. Athena warned him that the palace was overrun with suitors. They believed he was dead. They feasted on his land, courted his wife, and planned to kill his son if he returned. If Odysseus wanted his kingdom back, he would need more than a sword. He would need a plan. With a touch of her hand, Athena transformed him. His proud face withered into wrinkles, his strong back bent, his bright eyes dulled into a beggar's stare. No one would see a king, only a broken old man not worth a second glance. And hidden behind a guise, Odysseus would take back everything that was his. Odysseus moved carefully across the island, keeping to the shadows. Athena had guided him to the hut of Eumaeus, a loyal swineherd, one of the few servants who had not betrayed him. Disguised as a beggar, Odysseus approached the door. Eumaeus welcomed him without hesitation. He gave the ragged stranger a seat by the fire, shared what little food he had, and cursed the suitors who bled the house of Ithaca dry. Eumaeus spoke of the old king, long lost at sea, of Penelope still holding out against the suitors' pressure, of young Telemachus who had sailed in search of his father and might already be dead. Odysseus listened, said little. He warmed his hands by the fire and waited. The next day, Telemachus returned to Ithaca. He came straight to the hut, guided by Athena, weary from his journey. Eumaeus greeted him like a son, and then, seeing the stranger in the corner, Telemachus paused. There was nothing in the old beggar's face to hint at a king or wars of long-forgotten glories. Just another ruin washed up by the sea. But Athena stepped unseen behind Odysseus. With a flick of her hand, she stripped away the disguise. The wrinkles faded, the bent back straightened, the old light returned to his eyes. Telemachus staggered back, thinking he was looking at a god. But Odysseus spoke his name, not as a stranger, not as a king, but as a father. Telemachus stood frozen. And then, after all the years of doubt, of longing, of whispered prayers to empty skies, he ran into his father's arms. When the tears were spent, Odysseus pulled him close and whispered the plan. They would take back their home, together. No more waiting, no more running. The house of Ithaca would be theirs again, or they would die trying. Odysseus and Telemachus planned carefully. They wouldn't strike blindly. Odysseus, once more disguised as a beggar by Athena, returned to his own palace, walking among the suitors like a ghost among them. They barely noticed him. Some mocked him, some hurled scraps of food at his feet. None saw him for who he was. Telemachus moved among them, calm and silent, watching, measuring, waiting. Only a few servants, the swineherd Eumaeus, the cowherd Phaeacians, and the old nurse Euryclea, knew the truth. Each one swore themselves to Odysseus in secret. That night Penelope spoke. She had waited long enough. The suitors had eaten her stores, bullied her household, wasted her years. It was time to end it. She declared that she would marry the man who could pass a single test. To string Odysseus' great bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through 12 axe heads lined in a row, a weapon only Odysseus had mastered. The suitors boasted. One by one they tried, sweating, cursing, straining, but none could string the bow. When the last suitor failed, Odysseus spoke. Still in the ragged shape of a beggar, he asked for a chance to try. The suitors jeered. Penelope hesitated. But Telemachus, calm and sharp, insisted. Let the old man have his turn. Odysseus stepped forward. He took the bow in his hands, turning it over, checking for cracks, like a musician testing an old familiar lyre. In one smooth, unhurried motion, he strung the bow. The strings sang in the hall, a high, cold sound that cut through the noise. Odysseus lifted the arrow from the quiver, nocked it, drew back the string with a steady arm. He loosed the shot. The arrow flew straight through the 12 axe heads, as cleanly and easily as a breath through parted lips. Silence fell, and Odysseus, standing tall, reached for another arrow. The time for games was over. If you've watched the video so far, please leave a like and write "It's going down" in the comments. Thank you to my channel members, and now for the finale. Odysseus stood in the center of the hall, bow in hand. The suitors stared, confused. They didn't understand until he took her second arrow and shot Antinous, the loudest and greediest of all of them, straight through the throat. Antinous fell backwards, the wine cup slipping from his hand, blood spilling faster than the wine had ever poured. The hall erupted. Some ran for weapons, some tried to flee, but Telemachus was already moving. He raced to the storeroom where the suitors' weapons had been hidden He locked the doors. No one would escape. Odysseus loosed another arrow, and another. Each shot found its mark. Each man fell before he could lift a shield or draw a blade. Those who survived the first volleys rushed Odysseus with knives and chairs, shouting his name now, too late for prayers. Telemachus joined his father, spear flashing, the air filled with the clash of steel and the final, wordless cries of dying men. There was no mercy. Odysseus gave none, and he asked for none. These men had dishonored his house, devoured his wealth, and tried to steal his wife and kingdom. Justice had waited too long already. When it was done, the hall was silent again. Blood darkened the floors. Corpses lay where proud suitors had once strutted and boasted. Odysseus stood among them, unbowed. But what most tellings missed is what happened next. The bodies of the suitors lay sprawled across the blood-soaked floor. The air was thick with the stink of death and smoke. But Odysseus' work was not finished. He called for Euryclea, the old house nurse who had stayed loyal when the others had not. She came quickly, tears in her eyes, and Odysseus asked her a single question. Which of the servants had betrayed him? Euryclea pointed them out. The maids who had shared the suitors' beds, who had laughed at Penelope's grief and helped the invaders tear apart his household. Odysseus nodded once. He ordered the disloyal women to gather the dead, to scrub the hall clean of blood and ash, to wipe away the last traces of the men they had served. Only when the work was done did Telemachus lead them outside. Without ceremony, without speeches, he hanged them from a single rope, one after another, until the ground beneath the palace walls was silent again. The traitor, Melanthius, the goatherd who had armed the suitors during the fight, was dealt with separately. Eumaeus and Philatius seized him, cut away his parts he had used to betray his master, and left his body broken for the vultures. When it was finished, Odysseus walked the halls of his home. The house was his again. The price had been paid in full, and it was heavy. The blood had been washed away. The halls were silent again. But Odysseus still had one more challenge. Penelope. She had heard the sounds of slaughter. She had heard the shouts and silence that followed. And now the servants whispered that the beggar was no beggar at all, but her husband returned from the dead. Penelope stood at the top of the stairs, watching as Odysseus, scarred, older, changed, walked towards her. She did not run to him. She did not speak his name. If he was truly her husband, he would know something no impostor could guess. She ordered Euryclea to bring out the marriage bed and set it up for him outside the chamber. A simple request. But Odysseus froze. He told her that it was impossible. The bed could not be moved. He had built it himself around the trunk of a living olive tree rooted deep into the stone floor. Only the true Odysseus could have known that. At that, Penelope broke. The years of grief, the silence, they cracked and fell away. She ran into his arms, husband and wife, together again after 20 years of war, of wandering, of waiting. They wept for everything they had lost and everything they had found again. That night, Odysseus and Penelope spoke long into the dark, telling each other of all that had happened, of everything they had survived to see this day. And when sleep finally took them, it was not the sleep of grief, or fear, or loneliness. It was the sleep of two people who had finally come home.